Right, should we make a start? Don't know where everybody is this morning, all having a nice lie-in, but for those of you who've taken the trouble to come, it's all to do with procurement today. And we have got a guest who is Mike Cunningham. Mike runs a small-ish practice in Liverpool. He very often has year-out students and Part 2 students, and people who go and work for him have a good time because it's, as I say, because it's a relatively small office. I don't know if there's 10 of them. He'll tell us. You tend to see projects from beginning to end. He cares about his students. He's helped many students who aren't necessarily working with him with getting their portfolios ready and all that sort of thing. So he's a good guy. Who knows what he'll say this time? Last time he made some fairly wild observations. So we'll just see what he's up to. But what he's going to talk about is how what it's like to be running a practice and dealing with real clients. So what are we doing today? So under procurement, procurement is a catch-all phrase which is to do with getting the building built, but it actually is not just to do with the contractor. It's right from the very beginning how you manage the whole process. So it's like the whole thing about how you actually get something off the ground. So we're going to be talking about collaborative working, and sometimes that means contractors. Sometimes, as you know, it means other consultants. We're going to go through procurement options. And sadly for you, this is something that comes up in the exam. As I've said to you before, it's something that my Part 3 students sometimes get confused over. It's really, really important. The project that we're doing for the extension of the School of Architecture, it's quite possible that there will be an element of design build in that. We're not sure yet. But the way in which it's procured makes a major difference to the way in which a chosen architect develops their designs. We're going to talk a bit about project management, which is something which is part of our job. But sadly, because architects have not done this job very well over the years, there's a whole profession grown up of project managers who are doing it separate from us. So that we're doing the kind of design and lead consultant in terms of leading the coordination of the design, but the actual project management is being done by somebody else, and this is not a great plan. I'm going to say a little bit more about balancing program cost and quality, because that's really what project management is, before just trying to say a little bit about responsibility and liability, and how you avoid getting sued as a practicing architect. So there we are, lecture 8. Next week we get Stephen Brookhouse, the guy who wrote the book that I hope you've all been reading, the Blue Book, and he's talking about contracts. So again, he makes a very lively presentation. It's not at all dry, and I would urge you to come along to that. Okay. The library job I talked about in the very, very first lecture was procured on a traditional basis. That's to say, we as a firm drew everything up in a lot of detail. We then sent it out to tender to 6 contractors, and then the 6 contractors gave us all prices, and we checked that they'd included for everything, and then we went forward with one particular contractor who happened to be from North Wales, and he did a very good job and was very collaborative, worked with us, not against us, and the job got finished successfully. But the reason it was done well was that we were experienced, we did a good package of information, they were experienced, they got over the problems, and it all happened to program and to cost. So there's this thing called the Egan report, which you do really need to just spend 5 minutes genning up on in readiness for the exam, because it really it has directed what's going on since. And if you're wondering why on earth have we got all these design build projects kicking around, why has the contractor been given such power? How come the architect has lost their position? Well, it all starts here in 1998 with the Egan report. And basically what the government did was they got this guy who knew everything about industry. I can't remember if he'd been MD of Jaguar Rover or something like that. He'd worked in the industry, not the construction sector, but in a sector that made things. And he came to it all afresh. And he interviewed lots of people, a bit like a public inquiry, and he came to a number of conclusions. And some of these will ring bells with you, and others you think, well, that's a bit unfair. So the first one was that he concluded that architects are designing stuff for themselves. They're really pleased when stuff goes in the architectural press. They're really pleased when they get the accolades of their peers. And to be honest, there are some clients, but they're a bit of a pain, really. If only there were no clients, we could really do fantastic architecture. So I'm paraphrasing there, but that's what he felt, that many designers are thinking about just design and not thinking about what the client actually wants and delivering things that work. The next one was he perceived a lack of investment in research and feedback. Now, I've spoken about this before, and those of you who came to hear Field & Clegg talk a couple of weeks ago, Field & Clegg, Bradley Studios, do a lot of feedback. They work out whether their buildings really work. They ask the client, are they really happy? And when they've made mistakes, they hold their hands up and say, well, we'll try not to do that again. But actually, as an industry, we're very poor at that. We're poor at it because it takes a lot of time and trouble to do. We're poor at it because we don't really want to be told that something doesn't work very well, because we're worried someone's going to blame us that we haven't done the design very well. So as a profession, we're poor. But you can imagine, if you've been listening to the news, Boeing, who make, airliners, they've now got a problem with the 373 Super 8 or something, where there's been 2 crashes in the last 6 months. And they've grounded all these aircraft in China and Malaysia, I think. And of course, someone like Boeing or BAE or whatever, they spend millions of pounds feeding everything back in to make sure they don't make the same mistake again. They spend millions of pounds asking their customers, do they like the seat? Would they like a little shelf here? Did the thing work all right? They spend millions checking that those gas struts that you put all your stuff in above the cabin, that they last. Because an aircraft will last 30 years, 20 years, do millions and millions of miles. It has to be a super robust thing. The engines have to be very maintenance free and reliable, and so they spend a lot of time. Now, we do not do that as a profession, and this was perceived as odd from this guy who previously ran Jaguar Land Rover. He also noticed that there's lots of arguments going on between the architect and the contractor and the client, so that a good proportion of contracts ended in tears. That's to say, it really overran a long way, or it's ended up tons more money than the client expected. They're all very unhappy, and they all end up either in court or in some sort of alternative dispute resolution, which takes loads of time. A friend of mine who's doing a project in Liverpool, and it's about a £4 million project, the final bill on a £5 million project is almost £1 million over. Now, he has spent the last 9 months of his life defending why he made certain decisions and what he's done. Now, he believes he's definitely in the right, and the contractor is pulling a bit of a fast one, but He still spent the last 9 months defending his position. This is very emotionally draining and very expensive. No one's paying him to do that. So this guy, Egan, noticed there's a lot of that going on. He thought that architects, in particular, and the design team, have a poor understanding of life cycle costs. So when you build a building, the total cost of having that building sat there over its, say, 50-year life or 30-year life, it'd be somewhere in the region of 5 times the initial cost. So if it costs 4 million to build, it could easily cost 20 million over its 30-year life. So that understanding how you save money on life cycle costs, a roof finish that only needs to be replaced once, or windows that are really robust and the handles don't drop off, is a good idea. But as a profession and as an industry, we're not good at that. Next one was little involvement of subcontractors in the design process. So, if you're doing a really clever scheme with frameless glazing, then understanding how that works, you have to turn to the experts who do that sort of work in order to get their advice. But back in 1998, the way traditional projects were set up, the architect wrote loads of detailed specifications, kind of in splendid isolation, and then it was only much later on that the glazing fellow would come along and say, well, I can't make that work. We're going to have to change that. So there wasn't an easy system for pulling on the expertise of the supply chain. At that time, back in 1998, there was a £1 billion bill for building defects each year. So this is leaks, or problems with the ventilation system, or problems with overheating that had to be sorted. And if you remember, I showed you that pie chart where we had the claims against architects, and if you remember, over half of those claims were to do with defective detailing. Anyway, adding it up across the whole country, he concluded that's an awful lot of cock-ups and it's unacceptable. The next one was to do with integration of the process and the team. So he perceived poor project management, and at that time it was very much the architect who was in charge of the whole team and was managing the process, communicating with the client and making sure that everybody spoke to each other. And he perceived that was poorly done compared to other areas of industry. And last was the supply chain is detached. So that's a little bit like the item about the subcontractors, but it's to do with locking people in so that when you come to build it, it's not the first time you've spoken to the roofing fella, that he's locked in and he's completely in agreement with the way you're going about it and the way you're doing your gutters, so there's no horrible surprises halfway through construction. So those were the outcomes of the Egan report. And what you'll see is, as we go through different procurement routes, you'll see that the different procurement routes are trying to address some of those things. So now the client's perspective. What your average client wants is something that's delivered on time, on the budget that's been agreed, and to the quality that's been discussed. Now, it's quite possible that things may change, but the client expects to be kept informed. I'm not saying at the very, very start it was 4 million and at the very, very end it's 4 million. But if it ends up at 6 million, the client is completely clear on decisions that have been made and why that's happened. So we need to think about that, or else we will lose, as we have lost our position, as the kingpin in the construction industry. And in an ideal world, we would get away from this adversarial relationships. Adversarial means people who are battling it out, people who are fighting over everything the whole time. In an ideal world, we would work together, not against each other, and that would include the contractor. So looking forward, what has been perceived is that in not all cases does traditional procurement give best value, so that there might be other methods by which we can procure the work which will offer better value. That there should be more sort of integrated team at the outset. Again, about last year, when Fielding Clegg Bradley Studios gave a lecture about their Worcester library, they talked about involving ARUPS, the environmental engineers, week one, because that's a very clever building. It's the one with the big conical copper-clad shapes, and the way those cones work is they have a double skin, and the air filters through the double skin and then gets sucked out by stack effect ventilation or by low pressure as the air blows past. In order to make that work, they involved ARUPS week one. They wouldn't have got off the starting blocks if they hadn't done that, and they openly admit that. Whole life cycle costs are important. Now, this is a really, really tricky area, as we discussed in a previous lecture. But a mate of mine, someone who's my contemporary when I was at college, and everybody used to snigger about this guy because he always was doing up a place. He was always doing up some dodgy flat in Bristol, and then he bought a bigger dodgy flat. And then his poor family used to move from house to house as he did them up. Anyway, I went to see him about 6 months ago. His company is now worth £12 million, and he's now doing quite substantial new build projects. He is the developer and the architect. He is completely clear on what things costs, because he rents these properties out, and it's important to him to know what the life cycle costs are, that the windows he's specifying are going to last for the life of the building. The roof isn't going to need redoing in 10 years. But that's because he deals with all the costs. When we're consultants, it's quite difficult to deal with these things. But the principle is important for you to understand. Maybe as you get into your stride as professionals in the coming 5 years, things will be a little bit better in terms of the way life cycle costs work. Clients are genuinely getting much better now at selecting best value, not lowest price. This university is particularly good at doing that. They have a big matrix, and they work out what is in their interests and not necessarily what's the cheapest. The feedback, you'll remember from when we did the RIBA work stages, 1 to 7, you'll remember that 7 was feedback. And the idea was that 7 fed back into stage 1, so that the things you learned, mistakes you made, things you could have done better, fed back into 1. So that's now been recognised by the RIBA, and that was only introduced in 2013, so that's quite recent, that we are required in an ideal world to do it. And finally, working collaboratively. Well, as you'll see shortly, with many of the new building contracts, particularly contracts at this university, everybody is working collaboratively, really from quite early on, and that often includes the contractor. So again, the spirit of how to work on building projects has changed. Okay, so pay attention now, because this is important. Alternative forms of procurement. Traditional, I hope you know what I mean by that now. You do really detailed stuff, you do a proper specification, you send it out to a load of builders, they come back with prices, then you administer the building contract. So you are the contract administrator, and therefore the architect has a massive amount of control over what's happening. It's good for that reason. It can be bad because you're running a traditional contract, the client may be taking a greater level of risk if something goes wrong. The client can't just blame the contractor. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. The next one, which is a bit odd, so management contracting is where the contractor is paid a fee for managing the subcontractors, and then he tenders those various subcontractor contracts. So in the modern world of building, the way things work is a contractor doesn't really do anything. A contractor gets all the work done by loads of different subcontractors. So there'll be one doing the foundations, there'll be another doing the brickwork, there'll be another putting up the steel frame, there'll be another doing the roofing. And so what they do is they send out a description of just the foundations, and they get the foundation fella to give a price for just the foundations. They send an inquiry out for just the steel frame, and the guy who's good at making and erecting steel frames comes back and gives you a price. So then they put all of those things together and the building gets built. And of course, you can imagine it's a real skill to join these things up, because you've just got the footings done and you want to start the brickwork, but now you need to put in something else, or you need to put in the underfloor heating before you do the slab, and you need to think about those things. But essentially, it's a whole series of subcontracts that are separately let, and that is, all procurement is like that. Now, in management contracting, this contractor that I said is virtually doing nothing apart from managing things, instead of him keeping all of these prices secret and saying to the client, so my price for doing this library is 4 million, give me the job or not. He doesn't do that. He says, my price for managing the process is £400,000, and then what I'll do is I will tender all of these bits and pieces, the footings and the brickwork and the steel, and I'm going to show you that you're getting best value, because I'm going to go to 3 people each time, and you'll see that at every stage you are getting the best price, but you have to pay me a management fee to organise things for you. That's management contracting. Design build, I hope you sort of know what that is by now. You as the architect get planning permission. So you take the design to the stage that you would take things in the studio when you get to your final pin-up. You get planning permission, and then you send those drawings, even though they're a bit vague, off to builders, and you get a price. You then take on board a contractor, and all of a sudden everything changes. The contractor says, okay, I've got your scheme design proposals for this doctor's surgery. I'm going to do it for 3 million, and now, Mr. Architect, you're going to work for me. So I might change the type of bricks, or I might change the type of windows, or I might change the type of roofing to make sure I can do it for the price. And then the employer will have somebody helping them, called an employer's agent, managing the building contract. So all of a sudden, after you've done your scheme design proposals, the contractor is in the driving seat and you're working for them. The second type is design build, where you do it very, very early on. And that is the way this university works. At this university, they get very, very sketchy proposals, and then they send out an inquiry to a number of contractors, and they select the contractors on the basis of their track record and their attitude when you get interviewed. And then you marry the two together. Again, you put the contractor in the driving seat, and the architect is working for the contractor, and everybody sort of brings everything together as a team, so that you know really early on that you can afford it and it's buildable. And that's the way the Greenbrandt projects have been done. That's the way the Apex project was done. That's the way, I'm not sure about Crown Place, where the Crown Place went a little bit further. But anyway, there's a raft of projects at this university that have been done post stage 1. Partnering is where basically it's open book. The open book means you can see all the figures. So if something's costing so much, you're totally open with the client about what's it costing. And everybody works together to get the project built. It's not to say that the architect is working for the contractor, but the contractor is being completely open about all his figures. And very often local authorities do things this way, because if you've got a whole raft of jobs, then it's quite handy to be able to get things moving very, very quickly, and open book suits them because the adversarial side goes. And then the last one is tendering hubs. So this is where someone like Liverpool City Council will select 5 or 6 contractors to do all their work for the next 5 years. And when they send a tender inquiry out, they only send it to those 5 contractors, and they send a sort of slimline version. It's a bit of a sketch scheme. And then that contractor will say, well, I can do that primary school for 3 million. They get the job, and they normally have an architect working for them. Now, you don't need to know the details too much of those last 2. I'm only mentioning them to you because they are significant things in the world we work in now. It's the traditional management contracting, design build, you need to understand the principles. Now, if we were, my son's just is qualified as a doctor, and in their lecture theatres they have little buzzers. I would now ask you a question to make sure you all understand. Do you understand that? Is that clear? Yes? Great, you're doing a lot better than Part 3 students. So, pros and cons. The traditional approach has the advantage that we have a known quality, and that's why Marco is determined that the extension to the School of Architecture shall be traditional, because he doesn't want it watered down by any contractor saying, well, I can't afford that, let's have this thing here, it's almost the same. Don't worry. It has the advantage that you can issue instructions partway through, and you can change from a 4-bedroomed house to a 5-bedroomed house, and there's a mechanism by which you could value that. And when it all goes well, and we've done many, many projects traditionally, many projects, maybe, in my life I've probably done 50 major projects, and they've all gone perfectly okay. So when it goes well, the client gets good value for money, they know what they're paying for, and they're getting it to a determined quality. The disadvantages are any problems with design. So if you detail something at the top of the parapet and you forget to put in the little DPC that stops the water going in, well, you're going to have to own up to that. It's going to cost more money, and it can be very embarrassing. So any problems with design or the supply of specialist components becomes the client's problem. We did a project for John Moores University, not this university, and we specified some really snazzy Italian light fittings. And of course, like all of these jobs for universities, it had to be finished blob on September, because that's when all the students were coming back. So anyway, what happens in Italy is they all go to sleep during August, and these fittings, they just never came. And you couldn't even get to speak to anybody in Italy, let alone hassle them. So then the job was delayed by 2 weeks. And the client was incredulous that we could have specified a product that was so vulnerable to the Italian holiday market. But that was the truth, and it wasn't the contractor's fault. If it was anybody's fault, it was our fault for not foreseeing it. But the client had nobody to blame for that late completion. Cost can escalate. It's difficult to see all aspects of the job, particularly when you're doing refurbishment projects. It's quite difficult to anticipate all the problems you're going to find. Asbestos up in that corner, a rotten roof joist here. You have to do things. Even when it's a new build project, you can find there's problems with ground conditions, or you find there's a culvert that you hadn't expected. And they can impact on the costs, they can impact on the programme, and the client has to be fair and say, well, yeah, you haven't got a crystal ball, so I guess I have to pay you for the 2-week overrun. I have to pay you for taking the foundations deeper because we didn't know that the ground was going to be so awful in that corner of the site. Sometimes, and this is definitely the case with top practices, I could tell you of many examples where top practices are pushing the boundaries of what's been detailed, how things work, frameless glazing, extraordinary roofs that are made of glass or something, and a problem occurs because it's never been done before. It's a prototype, and that can be a problem because we do not build prototypes. Our buildings are the prototypes. If you're building a car, then you can imagine that handle that you use to open the door, That's been prototyped, it's been tested, it's been checked. They probably used it before. It's like a done deal that that's going to be fine. But very often, details we devise, it's the very first time they've ever been tested out and there can be problems. And finally, any of those issues can then cause delay. Now, when you have a delay on a job, and the contractor, and let's imagine the contractor's there and he's got 5 site staff, and he's got his cabins to hire and all the rest of it, and these things are called preliminaries, and you're going to be on site for another 2 weeks. So all of those costs, if it's not his fault, it's going to cost him more money to employ his staff, more money to hire the site cabins, then he has to be reimbursed for that. And this can be very expensive with a big contract or with a big delay. So all of those risks and all of those problems fall back onto the client to pay for. They fall back on the client to have to deal with the embarrassment of telling the students that your halls of residence aren't going to be ready. So now we're going to look at design build. And so what happens in terms of advantages for the client, so this is advantages for the client, you basically say to the contractor, you go and build that primary school over there. You've told me you can do it for 3 million. You've seen my scheme design drawings, so you know that it's sort of like this and it's sections like that, and I've given you a clue on what bricks and what windows I want it to be made out of. Get on with it. All the risks are up to you. So if you find there's poor ground, tough. It's your problem. If you find the windows won't come because they're coming from Europe and we've just had Brexit, tough. Sort it out. If there's an issue with the roof and the way in which the gutter's working, it's your problem to sort it out. Chat to your architect. If he's detailed a rubbish parapet detail, you better change it. Your problem. And if it leaks in the future, your problem. You push everything to the contractor. So that's brilliant for clients. They love it to bits. There's a one-point contact. So all of a sudden, here's me, the client, and there's the contractor. Everybody else is working for the contractor. So the architect, the MEP engineer, the structure engineer, the landscape architect, the interior design, they're all working for this contractor. So the only person I have to be cross with or get hold and shake is the contractor. Everybody else is under them. So if there's a problem with something, I'm only talking to one person, and that's brilliant. And finally, the way the contract works is any delays are up to the contractor. So like that situation I just described to you about the lights coming from Italy, that may well happen. It may well be that between the architect and the contractor they hadn't clocked that Italy's going to go to sleep in August. But that delay of 2 weeks, it's not the client's problem. It's the contractor's problem. So either they're going to work through the night in order to get the thing finished, or there's things called damages. And the client would say, well, look, you're 2 weeks late. That's costing me £20,000 a week because I'm having to hire other accommodation. So for that 2 week overrun, you're going to give me £40,000. And this is called liquidated and ascertained damages, which is a very strange term, but that's what it's called. LAD is this phrase for damages. From a disadvantage point of view, and this is where Marco is coming from, the client loses control of some of the detailed aspects of the job. In order to be able to build it for the price you've said, the contractor may then start cutting corners or using slightly different products, and you end up with a product that isn't quite the same as you expected. If you are doing your one-off house and you've suddenly decided you don't want a 4-bed house, you want a 5-bedroom house, and you think, I'll just get to the... And you think, I want another bedroom. So of course, it's not a problem. If everybody agrees, you can do that. But with design build, there isn't the same mechanism for valuing that change. With traditional, there's a whole raft of ways in which you value variations and changes, and it's by and large fair. I mean, it's a bit of a the client doesn't tend to lose out. You tend to be paying top dollar for these changes, but at least it's transparent and you know how you're paying for it. With design build, there is not a mechanism for that. So now you're in horse trading. The D&B guy goes, yeah, okay, I'll add that extra bedroom. It can go there, it's not a problem. You sort out the planning, it's just going to be fine. Oh, and I'll charge you 50 grand for that. And you say, 50 grand? That sounds a bit much. Take it or leave it. I don't mind. I don't particularly want another bedroom. It'd be much easier if I didn't have to have it. That's my price. It's up to you. So you don't have the same control over the cost of changes with design build. Now you might think adding an extra bedroom is ridiculous, but if you're doing lots of other types of things, for instance refurbishment jobs, quite often things come out of the woodwork and you have to make changes for very good reason, but still the mechanism for pricing those variations is not as easy. And then finally,